All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jessica Picard. I'm the Communications Manager here at the Department of Labor, and I'm joined by some of my colleagues, Mark McInerney, the Director of the Center for Workforce Research and Information, and Deputy Director Glenn Mills. And I will turn it over to them. Mark?
Thanks, Jess. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us here this morning. The purpose of this particular call was to announce that, well, we have released the updated 10-year employment outlook for the state of Maine. And we wanted to first offer a brief presentation of the updated employment outlook, which covers from the base period of 2018 to 2028. We have on our website posted the underlying data, as well as a blog article which offers some additional context about the new 10-year employment outlook. And we'll be presenting some information, some of the data from the new 10-year employment outlook, and then we'll have a chance to try and address any questions that may come up. In particular, we are mindful of the fact that this particular employment projection is from the base period of 2018 through 2028. And of course, as we all know, the labor market as the prevailing workforce conditions today are dramatically different from workforce conditions in 2018 when the labor market was particularly strong. So we just wanted to say that at this particular point in time, there's still a lot that we don't know about what the long-term impact of the COVID-19 pandemic will be on the labor market and how it may change work in the future. So we're still, it's too early. We don't have enough data to say for sure how much that those impacts will be permanent on the Maine labor market. But what we do know is that in the long term, over a 10-year period, generally, longer term structural forces will determine things like the size of the labor force and the employment level. And we're not projecting in this particular 10-year employment outlook that there's any direct connection between the current workforce conditions and the way that the labor market will look in 2028. Really, this is determined more by the structure of the population, the demographic structure of the population in Maine, and how that is going to change over the next 10 years or so. We also wanted the opportunity to answer some questions because we release 10-year employment projections every 2 years. And when the most recent 10-year outlook was released covering from the base period of 2016 to 2026, there were some misperceptions of that 10-year employment outlook. So we wanted to have the opportunity to present the data here this morning and talk about some of those misconceptions. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Deputy Director Glenn Mills, who has put together some slides to share with you all first.
All right, good morning, everybody. Try and get my slideshow up. Let's see. There we go. Can everybody see that in slideshow mode? Okay. Let me move you all. So as Mark mentioned, we've done a 10-year outlook from 2018 to 2028, and there's employment is lower in 2020, but this is a point to point from 18 to 28. So I thought I'd give you a little history of employment to provide some context of where we're at. We've had various rates of growth and change in employment over the last 7 decades. We had a very slow period in the 50s and early 60s, and then very fast employment growth in the 70s and 80s into the 90s, when many baby boomers were entering the labor force. And then after that, a slowing. And over the last 15 years, there really hasn't been much change in the level of employment. We had the decline with the 2008-9 recession bottoming in 2010 and back up. But as you can see in this chart, largely employment has been pretty stable around the same level, except for the cyclical aspects for quite a few years, about 15 years or so. And the early stages of the baby boom generation, which the oldest would be 74 this year, and the youngest would be 56. has started to leave the labor force. So the reason employment didn't change much was because our working age population didn't change much. And that is primarily because of a sharp decline in the number of births over the years. We had the baby boom in the 50s through the early 60s, and then a bump up in the 80s, the baby boom echo. But in the 90s and 2000s, there's been sharply fewer births, and that really has an impact on the working age population 16, 18, 20 years later when young people start to enter the labor force. So the decline in births in the 90s and early 2000s is impacting how many young people are entering the labor market today. Birth rates have declined throughout the entire world, but there are a few places in the world where they've declined as sharply as here in northern New England, Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. And that has left our region with an imbalanced population structure. You can see in these lines, this is the percent of population by year of age. And Maine has a much higher share of people in their 50s and 60s than the nation, and a much lower share of young people, of kids. So the people in their 50s and 60s will eventually be leaving the labor force, and those young people will eventually be entering the labor force. But this imbalance impacts the rate of change and the size of what our labor force is likely to be in the years ahead. I can't, see if I can get the zoom with the pic, there we go. So our forecast is for a small decline in employment, about 15,800. That is relatively within the range that we've been in. So that is not a sharp decline. We will have a labor force that's about 98% as large in 2028 as in 2018, according to our forecast at this point. And looking at this chart in our forecast, our last forecast released 2 years ago that went to 2026, we projected largely no change. Some of you will remember the number 94. We projected a growth of 94 jobs. Today, the decline is really not significantly different than what we were projecting 2 years ago. The most significant difference is that in 2018, the new base year, employment was about 10,000 higher than it was in 2016. So we're starting from a higher base. And the other part that's different is in 2028, that's 2 more years of baby boom retirements and a somewhat smaller population of young people aging into the labor force. But largely, we're projecting almost the exact same thing, except for that the time period has changed. And you can see the orange line there. It's still largely a flat, pretty stable situation that we're forecasting that has prevailed for 15 years or so now. And we expect that to be the case for 25 or close to 30 years of not much change. So to characterize that simply that employment will decline as a negative, I think lacks some context. So the breakdown of employment by age group will look a lot like this. The blue bars are the number of employed people in each of these age cohorts, and the red bars are what we expect. So we expect more employment among people 65 and over, and among those 35 to 44. And then in each of the other age cohorts, somewhat less employment. And when you net that all out, that's a decline of almost 16,000 in terms of employment. So our last forecast of largely no change or 94 jobs, when that was released, there was a lot of media coverage and a lot of things said in news articles and editorials I think that, from my perspective, weren't right, and that lacked a lot of context, and all of this gained a lot of attention. So there was a lot of portrayals of a bleak situation, economic stagnation, that companies would not invest in the state because of lack of workers, that young people would leave the state because of lack of opportunity, and that older people would be forced to work longer because of later in life because of the situation. Those are very dramatic characterizations, but there's more to the situation, and I don't regard the situation as nearly as negative as those characterizations. So we're going to talk a little bit about those and try to provide a more complete context to this situation. So the first, of a stagnant economy. As you saw in the first chart, employment grew very rapidly in the 1970s. But as many of you may remember, if you were around then, that was a very dark time economically in our history. Unemployment was very high, wage growth was very low. It was a period of economic turbulence. And wage gains, I don't have good wage data going back there, but wage gains were very low. Contrast to this period, especially in the 4 years just before the pandemic, our labor market was tight, we had very low unemployment, and the rise in average wages, this is adjusted for inflation, was the fastest on record. So that I would not call that a stagnant period at all. I would call that a period of not much employment growth, a very dynamic period where living standards were advancing substantially. So that connection that many people want to make between employment growth and wage growth, it's not, they're not nearly as correlated as many people think. In fact, often they are opposite of each other, and that, as was the case in the 70s and as was the case in these years just before the pandemic. Another aspect of that, to my perspective, we have a very dynamic situation. There's a constant flow of people into and out of the labor force in the different industries, companies, occupations. Some of this is as people retire, that create and new people enter, and those create opportunities for other people to move up. When we enter the labor force, we are at one point, many of us entered as teenagers in lower skill jobs, and then with college or other things and gaining experience, gaining different credentials, we advance ourselves through up the ladder. And so this situation of a lot of people retiring also creates opportunity for other people. In the period from 2018 to 2028, we expect an average of over 75,000 job openings each year and a total of over 750,000 job openings for the decade. That's more job openings in the decade than there are jobs right now. So I think the idea that this is a stagnant situation that will not offer opportunity to young people is not true. In fact, quite the opposite is the case. Getting back to that, one of the other characterizations was that lack of workers would deter investment, and lack of opportunity, there would be a lack of opportunity for young people. That's really quite backwards. When labor is relatively available and inexpensive, employers are going to hire. When labor is more challenging to find and getting more expensive, they look for other ways through productivity. And the tools we have today, information technology, automation, and all of that, that can do many functions that people once did, are growing and becoming less expensive all the time. Also, a tight labor market incentivizes investment in those productivity tools, and the tight labor market drives up wages, and that's an incentive for young people to remain here, and for other other young people to move here. And of course, many of us have read articles about what's coming with artificial intelligence and the capabilities it's going to have, and all the different functions that humans do now that could be replaced. So the notion that even if employment declines, that this will be a negative situation for people, I don't think is quite right. The idea that I read in a couple of articles that people have to work later in life is not necessarily true. We're not forecasting that. We expect employment of those age 65 and over to increase, primarily because there will be more younger seniors. The leading edge of the baby boom is now 74, and there will be more people each year in their upper 60s and low 70s. And of course, those people work at much higher rates than do people who are farther along, over 75 and into their 80s. So the rise in employment among seniors is really being driven by the fact that there will be more younger seniors. The structure of the senior population is shifting to the younger end, at least for a time. Eventually, with baby boomers advancing in age, when the boomers are 70s, 80s, and 90s, that will go the other way. But for now, it's not that older people will have to work. It's just that there will be more in their working years. Someone who is 66 years old is much more likely to work than someone who is 76, who is much more likely to work than somebody who is 86. I think we've all know that and have observed that. So one of the things that got around that a lot of people were accepting was that the staffing challenges, very low unemployment and high job openings rates that were prevailing in the couple of years before the pandemic were because of our lack of population growth, lack of labor force growth, and created this situation. Job openings data tells us otherwise. The jobs openings rate in Maine was the highest on record. We don't have data going back before the early 2000s, but was the highest on record. But it also was the highest on record nationally. And when you look at some other states where labor force growth was much more rapid, in those states where unemployment was also low, their job openings rates were quite similar to ours. The one area demographically that we can say that is challenging for employers is the summer hospitality industries. If you look at this chart, you see the blue line being Maine is much more spiky than nationally, and those high spikes are summer. So it's the case that hospitality businesses in the summertime are having a harder and harder time finding workers, and that is partly because there are fewer young people who fill many of those jobs in the summertime. And of course, there's the immigration issues with the H-2B program and other aspects to that. But the notion that the staffing challenges that prevailed were due to our demographics is not correct generally, except for hospitality. It's generally just that economic conditions were very strong during that period, and the hiring challenges that occurred here in Maine were occurring in most of the nation. So most jobs serve their local area. Retail, banking, you can go on and on. Some, of course, serve customers elsewhere in the country or in the world, but a majority of jobs are to support their local area. And productivity is always improving. So a labor force that is 98% as large in 2028 as it was in 2018, with normal productivity gains, should easily be able to will have greater output and will easily be able to meet the demand of a population that is about 101% as large. So the simple conclusions that a labor force that is modestly smaller will not be able to meet the demand for the population that I read many times, that simply is not supportable when you factor in the fact that productivity is always gradually increasing. So that's all we have for today. What questions do you all have?
Hey, this is Pete McGuire from the Press Herald. Do you want us to just jump right in whenever? Or?
Go ahead.
Okay, great. I had a couple of questions. First, if I'm just bear with me. I've got a couple of screens open here. But if we're looking at like, if I'm in your tabs on the data part of the website, and we're looking at growing, declining occupations. The occupations with the largest net growth, they include things like obviously a lot in healthcare, but there's also a lot of food preparation, waitresses, bartenders. Should we expect that to change given what we know about the job losses that that sector has taken during the pandemic and the struggle it's had to recover?
Yeah, well, so the long-term impacts of the pandemic we can speculate on what they will be, but they're not well known and well understood at this time. I've read many articles about a lot of people moving to Maine or buying summer places. So there's reason to expect perhaps that we'll have somewhat faster population growth, which might lead to no decline in employment. So this is largely preceding the pandemic because there's only so much about it we can know at this point in terms of long-term impact. The rest is speculation. What are the long-term impacts to restaurants? 8 years from now, will there be fewer people going to restaurants like there are now? I'm not sure. I don't think really any of us know. So we're treading a little lightly on the makeup of jobs at this point, since we do a new forecast every 2 years. And I think 2 years from now, we'll have a better handle on some of the larger aspects of what is taking place. The other aspect of that, Peter, is that after our last forecast was released, I read one of the occupational groups that we expect to decline is administrative support, clerical occupations. And I read an article where somebody said people will lose their jobs in those occupations, and that simply is not correct because the labor market is not stagnant. Someone who is in one of those jobs doesn't stay in one of those jobs necessarily their entire career. Some people advance to other types of jobs. Some people retire. And so we expect in every single occupational group, even those where employment is expected to decline, we expect large numbers of job openings to occur. And on our Outlook page, you can find a presentation. At the top, it should say something like charting the workforce. And in the latter sections of that, after the demographic parts we just discussed, you will see some charts that will show certain occupations we expect employment to decline, but you'll see another bar that shows that the number of annual openings will be quite large. So anyway, in almost every occupational group, we expect large numbers of job openings.
Okay, thanks. And that kind of gets to my second question, which is looking at this, if I'm still on the growing, declining occupations tab, I'm looking at largest annual openings. It seems like, a lot of the jobs here would not be considered, high wage positions, right? Compared to growing, declining industries where you have things like local government, non-durable goods, durable goods, which I assume is manufacturing, paper manufacturing, things like that, which,
Right.
you think of as higher wage positions or higher wage jobs. I mean, is it fair to say that like the jobs that we are going to lose or, there will be fewer of in 2028 are getting replaced with lower wage jobs?
No, and in fact, the opposite is occurring. So in terms of openings, the openings rates for lower skill, lower paying occupations are always higher. Largely that labor force is a younger labor force. Many of us, when we were teenagers, worked in those kinds of jobs. And then we have advanced our careers to the point where we are now. You know, food service types of occupations, I worked in those in high school. Many people do in high school and college, and then advance beyond them. So part of that is there's just the normal churn to certain kinds of occupations, the lower paying, lower skill occupations. You will find openings rates for physicians are much lower, simply because once someone becomes a physician, that's what they are. That's what they're going to be for the rest of their life, most likely. Whereas in food service, if you go into food service when you're 16 or 17 or 18, it doesn't mean that's what you're going to do for the rest of your life. You're unlikely to do that for the rest of your life. So jobs that have higher requirements in terms of education and skills, that take longer to gain the credentials that pay well, turnover rates are very low. Jobs where the barriers to entry that many of us can do, turnover rates are very high. You'll always see those lower paying, lower skilled jobs with more openings and higher turnover rates.
Okay. And the last question I had, I mean, we put these out every 2 years, is that correct?
Yes.
So is it safe to assume that, it's not safe to assume anything, is it logical to think that in the next 2 years we'll see another decline in the number of employed Mainers simply because of people aging out of the workforce again?
Well, yes and no, not necessarily. The long-term structural aspects of many more people in their 50s and 60s, each additional 2 years we go out, that's a larger aspect of this. The wild card, which you touched on earlier, is what are going to be the after impacts of this pandemic? Is there going to be a surge in migration of people to Maine? It appears that there are quite a few people looking to get out of the large metro areas. So generally I expect that there will be, for some period of time, a surge in migration to Maine. But until that develops, it's educated speculation at this point.
Okay, thanks. That's all I have for right now.
Okay.
Does anyone else have any questions? If you do, feel free to unmute yourself.
Okay, I guess I'll come back then. So can you maybe talk a little bit about the regional focus here? I mean, just looking at maybe like what coastal, central, western, and eastern, northern. Are there, what kind of variations in employment and the type of jobs available do you see looking further out?
Well, last year we issued a forecast that was from 2017 to 2027. You can look at that data. Largely, growth has been concentrated in southern Maine and along the coast. For several decades now, we've had generally declining population and employment in much of northern Maine, and kind of general stability here in kind of central Maine, and much of the growth is in southern Maine. Some of that is people from northern Maine moving south to southern Maine, but there is definitely a demarcation between the south, the central, and the north, which I would generally characterize as south growing, central relatively stable, and north generally declining.
Okay, do you see that accelerating in this most recent report, or is the pace of change about the same?
Yeah, this was strictly on a statewide basis. Next year we will do a 2019 to 2029 with the regions of the state. I'm not gonna speculate on what we will expect that to accelerate or not.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions from anyone? All right, seeing none, thank you for joining everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.